To kick off our session, we're starting with the Global Regulatory Panel. First off, we have Richard Shaw. Richard is a 40-year veteran in North American product development. He's based right here in Kansas City in the U.S. From a European perspective, we have Javier Van Begin as a European regulatory expert, and he is based in Belgium. Additionally, in Europe, we have Estefania Hinarejos of Spain. Estefania is well-versed in the development of biostimulants, biofertilizers, and biopesticides. She has significant experience in the regulatory pathways of bringing these bioproducts to market. From a South American perspective, I am pleased to welcome Ignacio Colonna. Ignacio is our Global Director of Science and Technology here at AgriThority. He is based in Argentina and has more than 20 years of experience developing products for both Latin America and the U.S. Additionally, we have 30-year veteran Errol Karkan joining us today as well. Errol leads projects in Germany, North and Western Europe, the Balkans, and the Commonwealth of Independent States. Lastly, but certainly not least, we have Gloverson Morrow. Gloverson is the AgriThority Chief Technology Officer and is an expert at commercializing products. Well, let's get to it and turn it over to these experts.
Always a pleasure to engage with Exceed the Seed. Well, the conversation on regulatory is always a difficult one. And the reason is that actually people are most of the time trying to dodge it. And although I always say that we can have an early conversation to see what are our options, we cannot avoid it. And actually, we should not avoid it. We should embrace it because that's the only way to have a coherent strategy, okay? From the beginning, we should have an in-depth assessment of the product. And based on that, we should really choose a clear path to follow in terms of registration. And from that moment onwards, all the efforts should be made to put the necessary information together to support that process. And if the goal is to register in several different countries, attention should be placed into building that information in such a way that can be used in all of them. Okay, so and also I would say that as you have that information, we should choose the order of submission, meaning what country goes first, taking into account the resources that we have and the timelines and how this process in one place can help the process in another place. With all that early planning, what we should expect to achieve is a more expedited process, a more cost-effective process, and for sure we are improving our chances of success. And I would invite now Estefania, who can probably talk about the details and the hurdles that you face in something like that in much more detail. Estefania, back to you.
Thank you very much, Gloverson. I fully agree. Strategy is indeed a must when you talk about biologicals, biofertilizers, biostimulants, plant protection products of biological origin. Commitments of time and cost impact also the choice of the, let's say, appropriate regulatory pathway. First, you need a really deep study into the wishes of the company, also the classification of the technology they use, and the stage of development, which is also essential to fit into the appropriate regulatory framework. In the case of Europe, for example, you have to consider that the registration and harmonization process is completely different if you talk about the fertilizer European frame, where biostimulant function, for example, is clearly defined, or if you go country by country through the different national regulations, or if you go with a plant protection product registration, which regulation is fully harmonized. Then you have the challenge regarding importation. This has to do also with being able to classify correctly the product and the compliance with the paperwork and registration requirements, not only in the origin country, but also in the destiny country. Correctly classifying goods with all the necessary papers can avoid delays in clearing goods through customs and incurring additional duties or penalties. Second, time and cost cannot be fully defined at the very beginning, but a range will be finally more accurate as the product advances in the development phase. Consider conservative timeframes, theoretical versus practical, and it is important to establish a solid data package that you can use all over according to the claims on the label of your product. This is very important. Another thing, for example, a critical step in Europe as well as other countries is demonstrating efficacy or efficiency of the product. With biostimulants, the rules can change among the different European countries, or if you go according to the new fertilizer product regulation. In the case of plant protection, demonstrating the efficacy of a product has to do with specific targets, crops, pests or diseases, but also has to do with the climatic zones. And this is a must in Europe. Third, today, regulatory predictions or regulation predictions are always difficult to make because of the political and social dimension that pushes sometimes unexpectedly for regulatory changes. Finally, today, regulatory strategy in biological products specifically is the art of aligning your brand. Okay, and now I'm going to give the word to Richard because I think he will go a little bit deeper into the understanding of importation and what is happening about regulation in the US.
Thank you. Understanding the requirements and the timeline for import or regulatory planning requires discipline to avoid disappointment. Key elements to consider include, first of all, failure to allow sufficient time for the process. Importing products into the U.S. for evaluation or sales can require as many as a dozen different documents to assure compliance with regulations of 4 or more government regulatory agencies. In some cases, additional approval is required by every state in which the product is intended to be tested. Complete preparation, submission, and approval of the necessary import documents usually requires a minimum of 8 weeks. The most common enforcement action reported on EPA's website is failure to file the necessary paperwork for import prior to arrival at the port of entry. Filing documents after the shipment arrives may not be viewed as a serious violation to us, but this can result in extreme fines, especially if the agency investigates and finds multiple instances of the same violation. For both regulatory planning and product import planning, a key point is the phrase does not require EPA registration. You must remember this does not mean unregulated. Fertilizers are highly regulated by each U.S. state, although they do not require federal EPA registration. Inoculants are defined differently in each state and are considered totally unregulated by EPA. They do not require registration federally, but many states have recently developed registration requirements for inoculants. 25B minimal risk products exempt from federal registration are required to be registered in all but 11 states. The critical product knowledge needed for approval to import samples for testing includes, first and foremost, defining the product composition. Products to be imported must be defined in specific detail. In most countries, chemical pesticides must declare the active ingredient as well as every other ingredient in the formulation. Those ingredients may be held confidential according to federal or state laws, but they must be divulged to the agencies in order to obtain import approval and registration. In the U.S., this is required by the EPA. Microbial pesticides must identify all ingredients and microbes must be identified by strain as well as genus and species. Purity of culture and absence of potential plant or animal pathogens must also be documented. Defining the intended use. To legally import a microbial pesticide in the U.S., it is necessary to obtain an import permit from USDA as well as from EPA. prior to arrival at customs. Both agencies must approve the intended experimental plan, including trial locations, responsible researchers at each location, and the area to be treated to calculate the total area to be treated in the U.S. Modifications in plans require a submission of an amended experimental plan to each of these two agencies for approval prior to proceeding. Microbial pesticides trials with imported products also require review and approval by every state in which you plan to test. Chemical pesticides for evaluation only require approval of the testing plan by EPA. Labeling, utmost important. Experimental pesticides for import must bear labels compliant with defined EPA standards. Even products that don't require EPA registration should have labels that are compliant with defined EPA standards for transportation and use for experimental purposes. Labels must be reviewed and approved by EPA before a shipment arrives at the port of entry. Labels on containers at the time of customs inspection must be identical to the labels previously approved by EPA. Minor clerical differences have actually held up shipments until you could submit revised documents. Even those agricultural products that do not require EPA registrations, such as fertilizers, mini inoculants, soil amendments, and 25B exempt products, are required to bear labels compliant with EPA and state regulations. Many U.S. states do not require registration of inoculants, but most want to review the label before sales occur in their state. Production and packaging at an EPA registered establishment. Products imported for testing as pesticide or plant growth regulators, chemical or biological, must be produced and packaged in an EPA approved establishment. The EPA establishment number must appear on the label submitted to EPA as well as the import documents. To obtain an EPA establishment number, if the manufacturer doesn't already have one, adds another 2 weeks to the import timeline at a minimum. And lastly, let's address very important point to me is the need for a customs broker. The best investment an importer or exporter of pesticide or agricultural production input products can make is to hire an experienced customs broker, preferably with experience in the agricultural business. If anything goes wrong, an experienced customs broker is much more likely to negotiate a resolution with customs that doesn't result in your shipment being denied entry or being shipped back at your expense. The critical knowledge needed for successful importing of samples is the same knowledge critical for an accurate projection of a regulatory pathway. Most clients want to define cost and timeline for registration before initiating a development program. Most expect a clear understanding of the cost of registration and the time required prior to investing in product testing. The truth is, this is rarely possible. Registration costs and timeline is heavily dependent on the crops targeted, the pest controlled, and the rates to be used. Defining these parameters requires multiple years of field trials to define. Any cost for timeline estimate prior to these definitions is highly speculative and seldom up to client expectations. The core knowledge necessary for meaningful discussion of regulatory requirements with EPA is a realistic projection of the label use directions to be supported by the generated data. Many of these import and registration processes are similar between Latin America and the United States. They're similar but different. And now Ignacio is going to comment on those differences and similarities between the U.S., Latin America, and the rest of the world. Ignacio?
Yes. Okay, thanks, Richard. Yes, so I coordinate the research and development projects from AgriThority in South America. And most of these projects include what we call new technologies. And new technologies, new input technologies, involve a large, wide range of products, including, for example, biostimulants, biologicals, or even chemicals with new modes of action that are not even included in the current defined lists by regulators. So the challenge we face here with these products is that most of these are not very clearly addressed in current legislation in most South American countries. So in AgriThority, we have spent a significant effort in developing a process on how to approach the early stages of regulatory for this project, for these products, to make this efficient in the long term. So a big question, for example, when we research a product is, okay, how do we fit this product? Is it a pesticide? Is it a fertilizer? Is it an adjuvant? Is it a raw material? And this is an important question because this can affect everything you do after that. So I want to emphasize 3 points here. The first one is, and for us, this is really important, is that our clients realize that this is a very involved process. This is a process that requires time and planning from the very, very beginning. So sometimes we get questions that people expect a very simple answer, like, here's the 3 points that you need to address. And things are much more demanding than that. So it is our goal to make our clients understand that this process is work itself. So the first point is, like Estefania said, to develop a strategy. So what's the strategy for importing the product? And this should include, what's the goal of the project? Is it registration? Is it testing? Is it both? Is this product the final formulation, or is it an early version that's going to be replaced by a new version? So these are important considerations. What are the claims the client expects from the product? Are these pesticidal claims? Are these more kind of growth enhancement claims? Are these nutrient claims? How is the product going to be used? Is it going to be a seed treatment? Is it going to be foliar? So these things are important to be clear, or as clear as possible from the beginning. The second point I want to make is that any importation of a new technology that's fairly complex or fairly novel will require a good package of documentation that we build together with our client, but we require a significant input from the client. And the core of this is proving that the product is safe. So this means sometimes we require a toxicology analysis, sometimes we require some sort of a study that addresses that this product is safe for humans and plants and animals. So this is a big component. And this is most of the time cannot be just addressed by an internal letter. It needs some external support, either a lab or a university study, something that can prove that the product is safe. So this is an important point. And then the third point I want to address is that whenever a client wants to work in several South American countries, either at once or in a short plan, it's important to have this clear from the beginning, because sometimes the strategy you follow needs to be in agreement across countries. And some countries have agreements, some countries can accept the permit or the registration in another country as a facilitator for continuing the process in that country. So this is important to know as well. So this is a brief summary of important points for working with new products in South America. Thanks.